Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Parthiban, and I hope everyone can see my screen okay. We'll get the talk going here in just a minute. People are still trickling in. Okay. This is our regular Wednesday talk, and today we're going to be talking about indoor plants, and I think I titled it appropriately by calling it Curate Your Own Urban Jungle. I've given this talk a couple times before, and I'm always adding new information. So this is sort of going to be a basic overview of indoor plants from whether you're just starting your garden indoors or you're a pro gardener, whatever it is. We're going to cover some of the basics, and then we'll address some of the questions in the chat. And feel free to type your questions in the chat. And at the end of the talk, I'll address them. So we'll get started here. Okay, so why indoor plants? Well, it's not just so that it looks pretty. It really has a purpose indoors. And in fact, back in the 60s and 70s, NASA scientists actually did an extensive research on indoor air quality and how to mitigate toxins in the air using plants, indoor plants. And what they found was 87% of toxins indoors can be removed in one day with indoor plants. And the reason because they absorb CO2, as we know, and they increase the oxygen supply. And in fact, when they absorb the VOCs in the air, they are then converting it through their root system and uptaking it as plant nutrients, which is absolutely wonderful. And Bill Wolverton is the scientist who did this research. And if you're interested in his research further, you can take a look at his book that he published in the 90s, I believe, called How to Grow Fresh Air. And it talks about indoor plants and the quality of air that you really get by keeping a whole bunch of indoor plants. And not only does it purify air, it has therapeutic qualities, and it does reduce stress up to 15%. I don't know how the percentages are measured, and if you're interested in the study, you could click the link on the PDF I'll be sending after class, and then read a little bit more about that. And sometimes indoor plants are used as privacy screens. You know, we're all into open concepts nowadays, and we are, we are still in the notes mode. Okay, let's see. Pause sharing. Sorry about that. Let's start over here. Always a little tricky doing this on your own. So let's see if we can do this right. Okay, voila. Are we okay there? Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that. Let's start over. So the details that I just told you, the link is right below on that screen. Didn't realize I was sharing the wrong screen. Yikes. Okay, here we go. Okay, fantastic. Again, going back to the why indoor plants, it is therapeutic and it creates a sense of being outdoors. You're really bringing the outdoors in, and it creates not only purifies air, but it also just creates a sense of belonging outdoors. And it's a great noise reduction. If you have a balcony and you're, wanting some sort of a noise barrier there from the roads or whatnot, you can create a really nice privacy and noise screening with potted plants as well. So just some of the things to note. Let's move along here. Okay, so plants are forever growing until they don't. And this means they need constant care, really. And there are 5 things that our plants really need. Well, I think there are a plethora of things that plants really need, but these are the 5 things that we all know that they need is good sunlight, water, humidity, air, and soil. And I'll be covering each one of them. Okay, so let's talk about sunlight first. Okay, so let there be light. We all know how important sunlight is to grow plants. And indoor plants, it's the same concept. So there are plants that are well suited for indoor growth based on the sunlight that it receives. Most of us, if we're lucky and have south-facing windows, we can really grow some exotic plants. But if you're unfortunate, stuck with north-facing windows or really not windows at all, not very much windows, then your plant list will be limited. Not to say that you cannot grow plants in a sort of a low light environment, but you really have to choose the correct plants for that environment. So it's really important to classify your houseplant plants into 3 categories. And I like to call them 6 hours or more sunlight plants, and then the medium light, which is about 4 to 6 hours, and then shade plants, which will get about less than 4 hours of light. And you can really understand a plant by the label that you get with the plant. So depending on where you're purchasing, you'll get the Latin name, and nowadays you can just Google, or if you've got some really good resources, you could look up the Latin name in the indoor plant guide books as well, and really figure out what the sunlight needs are for that plant and group them together accordingly throughout your space, your indoor space. And it's really important to kind of not mix and match plants that have different lighting needs. For example, you can't put a shade plant in a very bright spot. It could really be shocked, and vice versa. So be mindful of that. And if you have individual plant needs that you're working with, you can then figure out where every plant goes in part of your home. And then do keep in mind that more sunlight means more water, because the soil will be dry quite often. With a damp or an indirect sunlight area, you're not going to be watering as much. And you want to be also rotating the plants quite often, because it'll just sort of start leaning towards the light, and you really don't want that to happen with any of your plants. So constant rotation really keeps that plant sort of symmetrical and allows for an even growth. And then the other thing too is we don't often think about this, but our indoor environments, believe it or not, do collect quite a bit of dust. So it's really important to just dust the leaves, especially some broadleaves house indoor plants. They collect quite a lot of dust. So you want to just sort of go ahead and wipe the dust off the leaves with, I just use damp cloth, paper towel, or a cloth works fine. And if there's some sort of, say like, for example, we'll use fiddle leaf fig, broadleaf plants, and that really collects quite a bit of dust, I like to use biodegradable soap, just about a drop or so, and really dilute that with water and use a cloth to wipe it off. And it just gives it a nice sheen, and it's really not going to hurt the plant, but you really want to be mindful of what you're diluting with. So I use Dr. Bronner's, just 1 drop for probably 50 different house plants to dust. And you don't have to do this often, but it really does help the plant photosynthesize that much better. So sun is really important. Figuring out your exposure within your house and how many hours of light you get per location is really key to setting the plant where it's going to be happy. And next thing is water. So if we're talking about sunlight, we've got to talk about water. Like I said, if you're putting plants in sort of direct sunlight, you don't really get direct sunlight, but if you have like an atrium or a skylight or a large window where the sun shines directly through and hits the plants, you're really going to dry out that plant. And some plants don't like to be in direct sunlight there. Most of the indoor plants are, understory plants, so they don't like direct light. So, and if you're constantly watering because you're getting too much light, believe it or not, overwatering does kill a lot more plants than underwatering does, because it's a fast sort of death for the plant. If you let it just sit in water, it causes root rot, and it's really susceptible to all kinds of pests, really, and mold as well. So it's really hard to save the plants if they're overwater and they have root rot. If it's dry, there's the possibility of clipping the plants and transplanting and saving it or whatnot, but really overwatering, it's hard to save the plant. So be mindful of your watering. I'd say probably, I group plants, and I'll go into this a little bit further, but it really helps to group plants not only by light, but also by water needs as well. And they sort of go hand in hand. If it gets a lot of light, a lot more water, less light, not a lot of water, but still, nonetheless, you want to just sort of check for the moisture in your pot, within your pot, the soil really. And the easiest way to identify that is really feel the soil with your finger, and then you can determine the water needs. If it's damp, if it's dry, and it's a very simple method. And one way to identify if you're underwatering or overwatering is if you're underwatering your plants, it's easy to identify because the tips of the plants will dry out. So you'll get this like brown tips, and that it happens because it's underwater. So the heart of the plant will be holding on, but the tips will dry out. So, and then if you're seeing a droopy plants, that usually means, and soft leaf droopy plants, that means you're overwatering it. And you immediately want to take the plant and just kind of check the roots for dampness, and never, ever, ever let your plants sit in water. That's the worst thing you can do for plants. So it's fine if you're going to let it sit in water while you're watering for about 30 minutes or an hour. And once the plant has taken up the water through the leaves, you want to just go ahead and recycle that water or use it somewhere else. Just don't let the pot sit, the plant sit in the pot with water. And it's really important to keep a regular watering schedule, and consistency is really key for happy plants. And I like to water early in the day, once a week. Typically I don't believe I water more than once or twice a week, really. So if you keep the conditions in your home right, you shouldn't have to water more than once a week, and minimal watering at that. So if your soil's good, it's got enough nutrients and humidity, which we'll talk in a minute, you should be totally fine. Really don't have to water more than once for most of the houseplants. And let's move on to humidity. Okay, so airflow is really important. Without airflow and stagnant air, and oftentimes indoors, we're not going to have huge, breeze or winds and such. However, if you have a table fan or a fan, ceiling fan, or some sort of even AC, perhaps HVAC systems, and your plant is sitting right under that, be mindful of of that. And most of the plants don't want a whole bunch of airflow. Some do, but most don't like to have a lot of air. However, you do want some sort of airflow to happen. You don't want to cut off air circulation and just keep it in a dark room with no airflow, no windows or anything like that. So, and to keep the air moving, you sort of have to unclutter and ungroup the plants so that air just sort of moves around. And too much airflow can really take away the humidity. And this is sort of, opposite to what I just said, is group the plants together to create that humidity zone, but don't let them just sort of like be right up against each other, and really just sort of give some room for the leaves to breathe. Because morning to nighttime, the leaves do move, believe it or not. So they'll be sort of erect in the morning time when the sun is up. And then if you've noticed at nighttime, they'll just sort of droop down. So that's just what plants do. And some plants more dramatic than others, you can really see it. But they do breathe and they need some room to do that. So I like to group my plants together without letting the leaves touch too much. And then you can also mist these groups of plants that you've put together to create that humidity. And if your environment is really dry, you don't have any moisture in the air, then you can invest in a humidifier to keep the moisture level sort of happy for your plants. And then also watch for doors and windows. The drafts from doors and windows really do dry out the air for the plants. So if you're going to put plants on your windowsill or, near doors, you want to make sure that they're happy and they're thriving by misting them often and making sure that they're not drying out too soon. And the trick to sort of moving plants around and creating and keeping the humidity is, and also to maintain the plant long-term, is to use 2 pots. So we all love our decorative pots. And then the pots that will go inside the decorative pot is really key. I always double pot my plants. I don't ever plant directly in the decorative pot. The reason being is sometimes the decorative pots don't come with holes, and you really want good drainage for all the plants. So you never want to plant any indoor plants or outdoor plants for that matter in a pot without any holes. So you really want to do that. And if you already have plastic pots with holes in them and you find a decorative pot, it really takes that maintenance away to water and rotate and all of that without moving big decorative pots. So you'll hear me repeat this over and over again, but it's really a lifesaver if you have more than a few plants. So what this allows you to do is when you're watering, sometimes if you overwater, your decorative pot can act as a catchment system for the water at the bottom, and keep the moisture inside the pot and inside the plant, and slowly the plant can uptake that water. And then the watering. So when it comes to watering, typically what I do is I water, once a week a little bit. And sometimes, when you're away on vacation or traveling, not anymore so much, but back in the day when we used to do that, and you have to leave your plants at your house and not be taken care of, I used to add a little bit of water in my pot, so it just sort of helps a week or 2 longer. The other thing you can do is terrarium covers. and plastic covers to maintain the humidity, although they're not very attractive. And I've done this when I used to travel. I just cover it with sort of like a plastic tarp with holes in them to keep that moisture for my group of plantings. But you know, it's not at all attractive. But if you want the look of a nice little terrarium cover and things like that, make sure you're also not suffocating that plant and voiding them of airflow. So you can, you know, take the cover off and put it back once in a while as well. So let me see here. Let's move on to soil. So soil is another important factor among everything else. Let's go back. Okay, so I personally don't rely on the soil that my plant comes in. I buy from reputable nurseries, and I rarely buy from big box stores. The reason being is I don't trust their soil. I don't know what planting media that they use to grow their plants in. And if it's conventional growers, they probably will use some long-term inorganic fertilizer to keep the plant alive in the pot because they're putting it on the shelves. And you can typically notice these granular fertilizers in like green or yellow, tiny little balls inside the soil. And I'm really not a fan of those. And I try to grow my plants as natural and organically as possible. And I have several reasons for that. And one of the main reasons is I've got lots of animals at my home, and I don't want them eating a whole bunch of toxic stuff. So what I like to do is I like to repot the plants that I get immediately into a soil media that is organic and natural, potting media that is free draining and it doesn't clog up. And most of the indoor plants, they really want to drain. They don't want to sit in water. They want a well-drained soil, regardless of what plant it is. I know some of the plants like ferns and things like that, they like sort of like boggy, like just very dense soil, but we'll address those when we get there. So well-draining porous soil is important. You can use horticultural lava, which is great for indoor plants, just tiny little lava that is natural, and it helps with air spaces in the soil. Or you could use tiny little pea gravels as well. But I think my favorite's gotta be the lava for the porosity. And organic microbes are very, very important in the soil. So if you're getting the soil from the nursery and you don't know what's in it, what kind of fertilizer, how it's going to really last in your home, I would say go ahead and recycle that soil. I usually use it in my native garden area, just not for the natives, but a side of the area where the natives are. I typically just create a pile of unwanted soil. Later, then it just sort of decomposes over time. And then you can just plant it in new media. And be careful not to stress the plant too much if you're repotting. You want to just kind of leave some of the organic matter that it has grown into with the roots and all that. So you can just sort of not overstress the root ball and plant it into your new soil. And if you are planting in an organic soil and natural soil, and then you decide to get some conventional fertilizers to take care of your plants, it's sort of counterproductive. So do keep in mind that if you're planting in organic soil, there's a whole bunch of microbes that are beneficial to your plant, and you're putting in synthetic fertilizers, it's really not going to be beneficial in the long run. So you always want to use some sort of organic fertilizers, and I'm going to get to that here in in a couple slides about fertilizers, but we'll talk about plant care here in a few slides up ahead. Okay, so transplanting and repotting, there's the slide. So I've already said never plant in a pot with no drain holes, always use the catchment system. So transplanting and repotting. So when do you really need to transplant or repot plants? So you can repot if roots are really growing outside the pot and they've started to like mound on top or just sort of sticking out from the bottom. Just essentially, if the roots are growing out of control within the container that you've got them in, it's probably got to be repotted. So, and the other time to repot is also when the soil is depleted or settled. So if you're feeling the soil and you're seeing the flare of the plant exposed or the roots exposed up top, it just means that the soil has been depleted. And this happens in a lot of the nurseries where the plants aren't sold so fast and they keep watering it in the same spot regularly, or even in your own household, if you're watering it in the same spot, it'll create a little divot where the soil will settle or, you know, go off to the side, and you'll have this sort of indentation within the soil where the roots will be exposed. So you want to cover that up with soil and or mulch. And when not to repot is if your plant is happy and healthy, and if it's a large established plant, don't repot it. It's perfectly content. If you're repotting it to move to another decorative pot, really that's when this 2-pot method comes in handy. You can always change out the decorative pot if you keep it within a lightweight pot that you initially plant the plant in. Those are easier to work with rather than, you know, ceramic pots that you're trying to, you know, repot and move around. So, and then you never want to repot flowering or sick plants. A lot of the issues with the plants really stem from soil. So if your soil is sick, if your soil is not doing well and it's not healthy, it will really show in the plants. And if you have pests, sometimes, you know, pests will breed within the soil. And you just sort of want to toss that in the green waste and call it a day and not repot that and breed that environment. So, and again, pro tip, using 2 pots, probably going to be on every slide to use 2 pots because it really saves you a lot of time in the long run. So, and the nutrients for long-term care. So compost tea is really a lifesaver when it comes to indoor plants. Outdoor plants, what we do is we add compost, you know, for our vegetable beds or fruit trees or any shrubs that we have to provide nutrients. Indoors, you can do that too. However, we only have so much room in our pots, and you don't want the compost piling over or spilling over while you're watering. So compost tea really comes in handy because it's a liquid solution, and you just, you know, pour it into your soil as a soil drench. Again, it's not fertilizer, it's micronutrients that you're really feeding your soil. So once you use that, personally for me, I really have minimal need for using fertilizers really for any of my plants. And you can also use the compost tea as a foliar spray, in fact, for indoor plants too. The only thing that I would caution is they will leave water spots on your leaves, especially your broadleaved plants. And you just sort of want to dust them off, wipe them clean, because, you know, indoor plants, you've got to make sure they're looking good and happy. So you don't want to see the little water stains on your leaves there. So although I don't do too much compost defoliar spray indoors, it really can get messy. You can do it if you have a bathtub or a shower stall. You can collect your plants and just sort of do a quick foliar spray in your bathtub or your shower area, and then let it sit for 20, 30 minutes, and then rinse it off with water again. No problem. That's typically what I do. But for soil drench, watering is ideal. And then compost, like I said, it's really important to provide that organic matter for your plants. And you can actually put physical compost. And if you make your own compost, backyard compost, totally fine. You can sprinkle some as a mulch on top and water it in. And the compost tea, one thing with that is, there's a million different ways of, sorry, I'm jumping back to compost tea here because I remembered something here. So there's several ways to make compost tea. The tea that I'm talking about is sort of an actively aerated compost tea. And it's not a tea that's been just sort of sitting, and sometimes it can go anaerobic. It's not the tea that I'm talking about. You can make your own compost tea. I've done it several times. If you have compost, well-cured compost, or compost from your own compost bin, very easy to do. Take a little mesh bag or very clean, hopefully cotton socks or something. You can put the compost in that mesh bag, and you can drop it in a 5-gallon bucket with water and let it just sort of seep out. And I let my compost tea sit for about overnight. And this is sort of a passive way to get compost tea. So you're just extracting the nutrients from the compost, and you just sort of want to use like a spoon or a stick or a long stick to just sort of swirl the water around so it gets some air in there and it's not stagnant. So after 24 hours, I just take that mesh bag full of compost and I use that compost extract to water my plants. So you can make your compost extract, as opposed to the actively aerated compost tea. Lyngso, obviously, we make our own compost tea here, but that's quite an extensive process that we do. And it is aerated and it's constantly brewing. So if you're interested, I'll send you resources and you can go on our website to check that out as well. But, you can do compost extracts or teas. Really, really wonderful for your indoor plants. And it's a very minimal maintenance. And you'll notice that you probably won't even be using fertilizers if your soil is very happy and healthy. And then organic fertilizer. So I will say that if you are growing certain plants, indoor plants that you're expecting it to flower, say most often I get like orchids. Orchids are like the very popular flowering indoor plants that we have. People recommend fertilizing that. You can definitely fertilize that once or twice a year with organic fertilizer. And orchid soil media is completely different from most of the indoor soil media because it has to be absolutely porous and very bark-like rather than organic material like compost, really. Although I do add compost tea and compost to my orchids as well. And I grow, there's thousands of varieties of orchids, and I really don't want to get into it, but I set my orchids outdoors during spring and summertime, and they are very happy to bloom. And then I bring them indoors when they do bloom. So there's some tricks for that as well. So you can use organic fertilizers for plants that will flower. Just need some high phosphorus, high potassium fertilizer. My favorite sort of generic all-purpose fertilizer that I like to use is BioLive. That does have mycorrhizal fungi, and beneficial bacteria in that as well. So it's sort of my to-go fertilizer for indoors or outdoors. And I rarely use it, but I do use it. And I add humic acid. The BioLive already has humic acid. I know a lot of us have chloramines in our water, and city water does contain chloramines, and it can be counterproductive or detrimental to the microbiology within the soil. So when I'm making my compost extract or tea, I add a little bit of humic acid to the water before I put the compost in. I also sprinkle a little bit of humic acid in all my indoor plants. If you're fertilizing with BioLive, it already has humic acid. So what it does is it just sort of dissipates the chloramine within the water immediately. So that's sort of a natural solution to use if you have city water. And humic acid can be sort of bought anywhere. We carry it in a powder form as well. It's not toxic or anything. There's a granular form and powder form that you can get. I like the powder form because it easily mixes into the water. And I have this water filter, a carbon water filter that I twist onto my hose end, and I water my plants with it. So my outdoor plants, I rarely use humic acid because the carbon just sort of filters out all the toxins there. So for indoor plants, you can use that if you'd like. So, but if you're filtering your water, I know some of my customers, they have a huge Berkey water filter just to water their indoor plants. And it's a lot of effort, but love it. You could definitely do that. Okay, so mulch. So we talked about soil, we talked about sunlight, we talked about water. So mulch is sort of a generic term for anything that just sort of covers the soil and protects the soil. And the indoor plants, I feel it's all about aesthetics, and you really want to just decorate the indoor plants with mulch. And I've seen glasses, pebbles, and some people use coffee beans as well, which is interesting. You know, all kinds of things that you can cover the soil with, really. But the mulch's intended purpose is really to preserve water and not to let the soil dry out so much. So you can pretty much use anything that you like. What I like to use is bark. Bark kind of naturally decomposes and in turn will just sort of feed the soil. And I don't need to worry about inert material like rocks getting kind of lost in the soil of the pot. Although, you know, I will say for my cacti and my succulents, I mulch with gravel, very small gravel and pebbles, because I think it looks attractive, and plus they need very minimal care. For my tropical indoor plants, I use bark. You can use wood chips. Wood chips will take a little longer to decompose. Bark is sort of like the bark layer, right? The chip is like the heart of the tree, so it'll take a long time to decompose as opposed to the bark. You could use lignite peat. Lignite peat is a sustainable alternative to peat moss. It's really ground redwood bark, redwood fiber really, and it looks quite attractive indoors, and you can use it as a soil amendment as well. And if you want to just leave the soil as is, you can just add compost and not add anything else to it, no problem. You could do that because you're not getting that direct sunlight indoors as you would outdoors. So you can leave your compost as just your mulch and call it a day, totally fine. But whatever you choose, just make sure it doesn't restrict the airflow to the soil. So if you're choosing to go with gravel or pebbles or glass or whatever, the weight of that material will sit on top of your soil. So if it's a large pot and you're using 2-3 inches of that material, it's really compressing that soil underneath. So you just want to do a very minimal layer up top, not a whole bunch layer. I mean, more than about an inch, I think, is an overkill. And sometimes you can even stuff, you know, decorative like moss or something. You know, if you have like a wicker basket as a decorative pot, and then you want the plastic pot to be covered, you can do some decorative mulch covering so it doesn't, you don't expose that plastic container within the decorative pot. You can do that totally fine. I also like to move the mulch sometimes when I'm watering, because often when you water, the mulch and the soil will get mixed up and will disappear, and you don't have that nice aesthetics. And one more thing about watering is you want to be careful of how you water your indoor plants. You don't want to, as I mentioned before, you don't want to water in the same spot over and over again, creating that divot. And you also don't want to water so fast that all the water just drains right out at the bottom. So you just sort of want to water, watch it go down slowly. And if it's good organic soil, the water should just sort of trickle very nice and evenly. And if the soil's not that great and doesn't have that pore spaces, or the root hasn't just been creating this pore spaces within the soil, often the water will run down to the side of the pot, and where the soil won't stick to the side, and will create this little empty pocket for the water to run down. So you're really not doing the plant justice by just letting the water run down to the side. So watch for that. And if your plants are not draining properly and are not slowly absorbing the water, you probably want to consider repotting that soil media, repotting that plant into a good draining soil and organic soil that'll hold on to moisture at the same time. So watch for that as well. So once you water it, if it's not draining slowly and steadily, it's okay. Go ahead and water, wait about a few minutes, come back and water a little bit. Don't just pour the water one time and expect the plant to absorb all the water that one time that you water. So just a little tip there. I think I failed to mention that in the water section, but better late than never. So, okay, so we'll move on to pests. So pests are really not your friends, but you'll learn to love them because you have no choice. You want to save your plants, and plants nowadays, indoor plants especially, they are very expensive depending on what variety you're getting. So you really want to protect them. I mean, they can really be into the hundreds of dollars depending on the variety. So you want to protect them from pests. You know, if you've successfully found the perfect spot and found the water schedule, the air, humidity, everything is fine, and everything is under your control, and comes the pests. So this is sort of an external thing that you may or may not be able to control. So be mindful of where your plants are coming from. I mentioned this earlier, so make sure you buy your plants from a good, reputable nursery, not big box stores that don't care at all about their plants. Unless you want to rescue them, totally fine. I've done that quite a lot. And if you are bringing new plants into your already established indoor jungle, make sure that there are no pests in your new plants that you're bringing into your garden inside. So, and pests can be tracked by, tracked indoors through outdoor pest infestation also. So if you have for me, I have a section of sliding glass doors leading to the patio in my backyard garden. And sometimes if I have a pest infestation, I'm very mindful of not bringing that indoors with tools or watering cans or gloves or whatever I'm doing. I'm very mindful of not bringing that to my indoor plants. And then sometimes we get flowers, cut flowers, or flowers people send to us. Inspect them for any sort of pests or bugs. There shouldn't be any, but sometimes I've seen little crawly things in there. And if you're putting that as an arrangement next to your indoor plants, they can also transfer that way as well. And if you're going to, your farmer's market or buying vegetables or leafy greens, they may have some sort of a pest infestation. And if you have a kitchen garden like myself, you want to be mindful of where you're cleaning your vegetables and fruits and all that. So you're not transferring outside pests indoors. So how do you get rid of these pests if, say for some reason you've got something that's attacking your plant, indoor plant, and you want to get rid of them? Well, really depends on what kind of pest you're working with. Regardless of what it is, you want to quarantine. So the first thing is isolate that plant or plants into its own room or a section of your home where it is going to be by itself. And you're going to give it the much needed TLC it's going to deserve to nurse it back to health. So first thing I do, I've had several pest infestations, and my least favorites are mealybugs and aphids, of course. What I do is I take them in the shower, in the tub, and I wash them with my handheld shower thing. I rinse them thoroughly. And this is sort of a meticulous job for me, but I go in and I physically kind of squish all the little critters. And I hate to do this, but I do this because I think the plant is worth more than the bugs. So I physically, if I find them, if I can see it, I go ahead and squish them all. It seems a little aggressive, but that's what I do. And then I rinse it again with water. That seems to take care of it most of the time. But there are some pests that will breed, like I said, in the soil, and you cannot really see it. May have the eggs or larvae within the soil, and you think you got rid of it, but it'll just sort of creep up on you later. For that, it's probably best to just sort of repot the soil itself, or just toss that soil away completely. Take the plant outside, take the plant from the pot, or uproot the plant really. And then again, I wash everything. I wash the soil off the roots with my spray, and then I'm just left with the plant without any soil. And then I find a new soil media, and then I pot the plant in that. It's sort of an extreme case, and if you have pests within your soil rather than your plant. So that's one way to do that. Make sure washing is the key, and water just sort of wipes away most of the pests, in my opinion. The other thing you could do is you could also use very mild soap, biodegradable soap, and that is eco-friendly, not any harsh, chemical Dawn or any. I know people use Dawn for a lot of things, but I don't use that for plants at all. So again, we can do an unscented Dr. Bronner soap again, just a drop, dilute that really well, and then you can wash the leaves. If it's a broad-leafed plant that's easily washable, you can use mild soap and water. And you don't want to get this soap in the soil. It will be counterproductive to the biome that you're trying to grow within your soil. So you sort of want to just cover the soil with plastic or something, shield the pot, and then you can wipe your leaves or the stems and branches and things. So I had mentioned compost tea. I really am a true kind of a believer in compost getting rid of pests. I know some folks don't think it would, but it has really helped for me. I use that as a foliar spray, and it just sort of protects the plants from any susceptible things out there. So any sort of pests and stuff. And again, it all begins with having good soil, good healthy plant that can sort of defend itself from any pest attacks. So neem oil is also pretty good, although it's not so good for the soil. So if you're using any of the sort of the Bayer stuff, neem oil or diluted neem oil or whatever, it's fine if you have a heavy infestation to use. However, don't get it into your soil because it can kill the microbiology as well. So you could use that as a last resort. And if nothing else works, all else fails, I would just compost your plants and say goodbye. And the hard thing is, if, you know, like I said before, if you have root rot or any like sort of mold issues, it's really hard to mitigate because those are related to excess moisture. So it just means that it has already gotten to the root of the plant. And if the root of the plant is attacked, it's really hard to save that plant. So sort of stems from watering issues. You don't want to let your plants really rot from that. Okay, so the biggest pest, I think, are pets, personally for me, but I do live with dogs and cats. So if you have a whole bunch of indoor plants that have holes on the tips and you're wondering, you know, what kind of pest it is, it very well could be your cats or dogs nibbling at the tips of the leaves and stuff. So, and there are also a whole bunch of plants that are toxic to your pets. So be mindful of where you place your plants, toxic plants. My animals are pretty good about leaving the plants alone, but when they were younger, they used a few of the plants as litter box and they would be chewing the tips off constantly. So, and if you do have pets like myself, your best bet is to find pet-friendly houseplants that are non-toxic and it's hard to destroy. So, and okay, so now that we covered some of the basics of how to take care of houseplants, I'll give you some resources and we'll go through this fairly fast because I don't want to spend too much time with this because I would like to take some questions at the end. So here are some of the easy care plants. It's from plantarina.com, and you'll get this PDF copy of the presentation with all the links and all the pictures that are included in the presentation. They all have links. Some are exciting links and some aren't. So feel free to click through and find the ones that that you like. Okay, so we'll talk about easy care plants. So I think one of the most easiest plants to take care of are tillandsias. And these are air plants. I know this is gaining popularity now. You see them everywhere. Super, super easy, no soil, no, extensive watering. Super easy to care for, really. So I would start with these, and these are also really easy to propagate. I think every single tillandsia that I've gotten pups out of them. So once they bloom, the mother plant will create pups at the bottom, and they can easily be divided and grown until they flower and they create their own pups as well. They are very tolerant of various temperatures, and you just soak them once a month or mist them And I do recommend sort of fertilizing them the way that I fertilize my Tillandsia, probably once a year, just to encourage them to kind of bloom. But once they bloom, they're sort of done, some of them. Well, most of them. And I have had success with them flowering indoors. They need bright light. So, and then I do fertilize. I mix my fertilizer in water and let them sit in a bowl of water with the fertilizer for about probably 15, 20 minutes. And then I rinse it off with water again so it doesn't leave residue. So, so I would do that. And then cacti and succulent, very minimal care, near impossible to kill unless you're overwatering. Wonderful for really bright, sunny areas. And they're gaining all the attention nowadays, I think, because they're really statement pieces. Some of the euphorbias and things like that. Although it's really hard to grow some of them indoors if you don't have good light. So make sure to place them in a very bright spots. And bromeliads, you know, they're just sort of the tropical fun plant that everybody gives us gifts. And you see them at your local grocery stores all the time. So very easy to take care of. Needs lots of water. These can sit in water for a little bit. And then, because they come from high humidity area, but they also need well draining soil media as well. So again, go ahead and click through the links in each of these pictures, and then you'll find ample resources regarding each variety of plants shown here. And then ferns. So I was saying earlier that ferns really need a whole bunch of water. Low light plants, very easy to take care of. They grow quite a bit. I think one of my favorite ferns are probably the staghorns and bird's nest ferns. Whole bunch of varieties. I think they're super fun. You can also use them in terrariums as well. Pair them with high humidity plants also. And peperomias, whole bunch of varieties. Very, very hardy. They do like a lot of moisture. However, the leaves are very hardy. They will hold on to a lot of moisture. So I try not to water my peperomias too much also because they can rot, especially the smaller leafed peperomias. They can rot very quickly if overwatered. Okay, Hoyas. Hoyas are sort of interesting and exotic looking plants. For example, the second one here, you've probably seen them in grocery store as just a single heart leaf, but it's actually a vine and it climbs and it grows. So when you're purchasing your plants, you're buying them as propagated small, transplanted plant, but they can really grow quite large. So be mindful of that when you're getting them and expecting them to stay small. Most of the plants, you can prune them and keep them small, but any of the vines, they can get really mangy and unkempt if not trimmed. So I'm constantly pruning them and cutting the tips of them to encourage sort of a bushier growth rather than a lengthier growth. And if you let any of the vines grow, they will grow for days. They will be really, really long and unmanageable. So I like to root them as soon as I can, and you can propagate them that way as well. So, and Hoyas do bloom, believe it or not. I think I've had most of my Hoyas bloom indoors with, pretty bright light, and they're very, very impressive. For example, the dark one there, I think it's called Black Dragon or something. Black Dragon Hoya, very exotic flower of a Hoya plant there. So resources are found there. Okay. So the Marantas, Calatheas, and Stramenthe. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the last one there, but these are also some varieties. The Marantas, probably my favorite. They're called prayer plant, and there's several varieties of Marantas. They're variegated ones. They're really like light green ones. I mean, you know, several different varieties of Marantas and Calatheas too. I mean, they're just really striking because their leaf structure and leaf patterns are very exotic and unique to each of the varieties. And we've now just sort of hybridized a whole bunch of them. And these are all easy care indoor plants. So I highly recommend them if you're grouping patterns and things. These are very attractive. Another one are palms. You don't think of palms as indoor plants, and that's probably because we've, you know, grown up with palms outdoors in California probably. But you can grow them indoors. There are a certain variety of palms. I mean, not all palms can be grown indoors, granted, but there are house palms, indoor house palms that you can grow. So if you have high ceilings, or if you want sort of a statement piece, you know, that real jungalow sort of look, you can select palms that will grow in bright and direct light. Again, watering needs do differ, and you can grow a really nice palm in a gallon or 5-gallon container, not a problem. And you can also bonsai some of the palms as well to shorten them. And this is actually not bonsai, it's called a ponytail palm, and that's just how they grow. The last one there. Okay, monsteras. So the hype with monsteras, I really sort of didn't want to put these in here, but I will. Everyone knows about the monsteras, and it's very popular. And these are different sort of monsteras here, and you can just click on each of the links to find out a little bit more about them. They're not really that hard to take care of. All they want is high humidity. Really, these are tropical plants and they want high humidity. So if you're misting them, and again, if you're not overwatering them and misting them and keeping them happy, they'll grow really, really high. And in fact, the Monstera deliciosa is, you know, it has the fruit is edible. So never had a fruit in my Monstera indoors ever. So I'm not sure how you would cultivate that, but in their natural environment, they're harvestable and edible. So you can check into that. And the one thing with Monstera I will tell you is they are climbers, and they can be very invasive. Meaning they send out these external root structures that will adhere to anything that is natural, meaning like wood or, you know, bark or something like that. They will stick their roots out and then will wrap onto them. So if you're putting your Monstera against something like a table that is a wooden table or something, be careful about their roots reaching for that table as a support. It won't happen overnight. That'll slowly sort of creep up and reach for it. And I have trimmed the roots of the Monsteras before, so it's really heartbreaking to do, but I've done them. So it's a challenge with Monsteras because they are climbers. You can just sort of prune them, meaning you can top the or clip the tops off the Monsteras and have them bush out more rather than be sort of a vine-like feature, and really get creative with how you grow them. So, okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the Monsteras, and you can click on the links and find out more about them. Ficus, the famous ficus that we all know is Ficus lyrata, turtle leaf fig. We all love them. Ever gaining popularity with indoor gardeners. I have to say my favorite ficuses are the small leafed ficuses. My new favorite one is the Audrey, which is the top left one here. It has a very light bark, unlike the other ficuses. And it's much easier to grow than fiddle leaf fig. It's not as finicky, probably one of the hardest plants to take care of, but it's not impossible to do. They really do not like draft. So I advise if you have door or windows nearby and you really want to get a fiddle leaf fig, I don't recommend it unless you're going to keep them happy with high humidity at all times. So, and there's hundreds of different varieties of ficus that you can check out as well in the resources. Okay, so the philodendrons often gets mistaked for monsteras as well, but philodendron is its own plant category. The elephant ear to the far left, that sort of mostly gets confused for a monstera. Sometimes you can't tell if it's a philodendron or a monstera, but I'm sure the plant nursery can help you identify which one's which. But really exciting varieties as well. Also very easy to take care of, most of the varieties. I have some of the philodendrons, in fact, growing outdoors in soil, not planted by me, but previous homeowners decades ago. So I have very happy philodendrons growing in our native climate outdoors. So granted, it is north facing, no direct sunlight, it gets lots of moisture. So it's very, very happy there. Begonias are old time favorite begonias, really thousands of different varieties of begonias. I think they're gaining popularity with indoor gardeners again. Some can be really finicky to grow. And if you really want the begonias to flower indoors, which I have done, I think my favorite begonia that I recently discovered was Santa Cruz Sunset, and just has this really striking bright orange flowers. And that sort of grows vine-like rather than sort of bushy. So you top them off, and I've just sort of kept it bushy a little bit. So begonias are wonderful old time plants to keep indoors as well. Very, very fun textured leaves. Pallayas. Pallayas are what I like to call micro-leafed plants. A lot of the pallayas have very, very tiny leaves, and I love that. It can be potted with other plants as arrangements, a grouping, and the trailing pallayas, they can also be a nuisance if you let them grow too much. They can really trail down and be sort of messy, so keep them trimmed, and for the growth of the pot size. Really don't let them sort of overgrow. If they're overgrowing, that just means they're really happy. Whatever you're doing, it's wonderful. So you can also propagate them too, which I'll cover here in a few minutes. So really there's thousands of varieties of indoor plants. You can check with your local nurseries. Now you can buy indoor plants online, really from anywhere in the world. But make sure most of the indoor plants should be okay in our California climate here. So you can check out some of the varieties here. Okay, so design inspiration. So these are very sort of to each their own. You can keep it simple, keep some treasures from travels, and keep some plants as complementary objects, and just know that once they grow larger than the pot itself, you really want to trim them and keep them just tidy, or they can get really messy. Or you can go wild and really fill the entire shelf with plants and you know, mix and match sizes and textures. You can keep the pots in the same color scheme. I love terracotta pots. I think they're wonderful. I don't like them indoors for the reason that I immediately want to plant my plant inside the terracotta pot. To me, that's just the way I've grown up. I've always planted plants in a terracotta pot, but now I'm sort of on a low maintenance track. So I put a plastic pot inside a pot so I get more of a ceramic coated pots. And with the terracotta pots, you can see some, you know, hard water stains if you're watering it with hard water, or some mineral stains that may not be attractive indoors. Outdoors, I think they're fine, but that doesn't mean you cannot do them or plant them in terracotta. But if you are, just make sure that there's a catchment system for that as well. And you can have fun with your pots, lots of colors and textures, and really get creative with vines and hangings. Just know if you're having a whole bunch of vines and they are hanging from the ceiling, make sure the weight is, that the hook is able to handle the weight of the pot, especially on watering days, because the pot will get quite heavy with water. So, okay. And then, like I said, you can group the plants together for high humidity and easy watering needs. I like to group plants with patterns, the leaves with patterns together. Similar leaf pattern really works, you know, keep it minimal, or you can really go wild. You can have fun with your textures and create that true jungalow. It's really up to you what aesthetics you're going for. So I'm going to talk briefly about propagation. And to me, propagation is really free plants. And I almost always propagate all my indoor plants. It's very easy to do. You could either, depending on the plant, you can divide the plant rhizomes and, you know, plant them, or you can take cuttings, the tips of the plants, and root them in water, or you can transplant them directly in soil. And the key thing is really to protect all your transplants or all your clippings and cuttings until the new roots are established. And you can give them away. I do give them away as gifts to friends and family, and it's a very easy and free gift. It just takes a little bit of time, but I think it's wonderful if you can propagate your own plants. And sometimes some nurseries, if they're hybridized an exclusive plant strand to a vendor, they will always say no propagation for commercial sale. So that doesn't mean that you can't propagate for your own use. It just means that you can't propagate their hybrid plant and sell them, essentially, is what that means. So although there are lots of plants I've successfully propagated that has that note. Never sold any, but for my own purposes, of course. So I would highly recommend you, when you're trimming your excess growth, just plop them in water, watch for the root growth, and then you can transfer them into soil. And there's a whole bunch of resources on how to propagate as well. The key thing is you really want to change out the water quite often when you're propagating. Okay, so here are some of the local Bay Area resources. Some of the nurseries that I really like, and they have a pretty good selection of indoor plants. And I'm sure there are many, many others, but these are just some that I've listed that you can check out. And then here are some indoor gardening books that I recommend. And I think they're not only pretty, but they're full of information as well. And I think most of these, you can find them as ebooks on Amazon. So I think hopefully I've linked all the books here. And that's pretty much it. So that's my presentation. Just be proud plant parent and shower your babies with love, and hope you folks have success in your indoor gardening. And I think what I'll do is I'll open it up for questions now. Let's stop sharing. Okay. Alrighty, so you should be able to unmute yourself. So if there are any pressing questions that you have, I haven't looked at the chat. I know we've got that going, but go ahead and feel free to unmute and ask them. Yes, Kim, I think I see your hand up there.
Thanks. So I really have had success with what you're recommending with the plastic pots in the cache pot. But when the plant outgrows the pot it comes in, I've had real difficulty being able to buy those pots, you know, to get them into a bigger pot. I mean, the kinds of things I've seen, they have a lip on them, plastic pots, they have a lip on them, and then I can't fit it in the cachement pot. And also, I don't love buying more plastics, but I have to say it has been pretty successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. The lip thing is really frustrating. I know what you're talking about. What I do is I physically just cut them. I cut them and make it fit. I know it doesn't look attractive, but I know that I'm going to be mulching to cover the actual plastic pot. So that's one trick that you can just sort of do if you don't want to buy new, you know, pots and stuff. And what I've noticed is, or in my garden, I save the outdoor pots that I get, you know, the little transplant vegetable things that I get, or even a gallon pot, and I use that, and I would cut it to fit the pot that I have. I've also used unconventional things as pot for my plants, such as candle holders. You know, when you burn the candle, you're left with this glass container. And those are wonderful plant pots. And some of the candle containers, I feel like I buy them just for the containers. So I really do reuse them as as a pot, decorative pot. So yeah.
You can also unused, Kim, you can also buy unused nursery pots. So those black 1 gallon, 5 gallon, 15 gallon. You can buy them at Wegmans or other nurseries, but they're empty and they're really affordable too.
Great. I've noticed they are too tall, so I didn't think about cutting them down. Can you say anything about how to transplant, you know, which plants you can separate, which, like, should you be cutting the roots when you're, you know, moving them to a bigger pot? Is there a time of year you should be doing that?
Well, for indoor plants, personally, for me, I don't really look at the time just because, or seasons, I should say, just because I have sort of a controlled environment, and it's typically the same all year round. The exception of summer, it can get really hot sometimes. But I don't really wait for a perfect time to transplant indoors. However, that's not the case for outdoors at all. So I don't think seasons really come into play when you're transplanting them. Like I said before, when the plants are blooming or about to bloom, or they're happy where they are, I don't recommend transplanting then. You can do it after they're all bloomed out, and then you can just sort of prune them back and then transplant them after. But you really don't want to disturb them while they're at their peak growth.
And then I'm sorry if I missed this part. Whenever you're up potting, did you mention that you use essential soil, or what's your favorite soil for up potting?
So yes and no. So essential soil is my all-time favorite soil for, of course, fruit trees and vegetables and a lot of my indoor plants as well. I've noticed for my large indoor plants, and I have some really gigantic ones that are, 4 feet tall and like 2 feet wide for some of my plants. And I've filled the essential soil all the way up to the brim. And now over time, it just sort of like settles. It's not compacting, per se, but the plants is uptaking all the nutrients, and with any soil, it just sort of tends to settle over time. And essential soil gets really heavy for me to move around. And I know I preach that use a 2-pot method, but for this particular large container, I didn't want to use a 2-pot method just because it was sort of like a concave urn-like pot. And I ended up filling it with essential soil. And boy, that was really hard to move. So depending on what you're planting, you can use essential soil or the potting mix I really like. Sunland Garden does like a very lightweight mix. Sometimes I will use to propagate some of my plants, and I'll plant it in temporarily. And then the potting mix with the horticultural lava, I think it's wonderful. So really, I mix and match my soils, and often I make my own sort of soil with extra ingredients like the lava or the gravel. And I add a little bit of the BioLife fertilizer into the soil mix, so it has some nutrients with the long-term growth. So yeah, and I would say you can absolutely use the essential soil, but just know it's going to be really heavy if you're trying to move, hundreds of plants around, trying to rotate them. Okay, any other questions? Should I read off some of the questions in the chat here?
Hi, Jan, I have a question.
Yes, hi.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. This has been great. So I had a quick question about the humidifier. So I have one and I run it most days. And the temperature in our home is like usually normally around 67. So I'm wondering if it matters to have your house at a certain temperature and then also have the humidifier going?
It's good to have constant temperature. It's really the draft that dries out the humidity. So if you have the humidifier going and you also have a lot of air movement in your house, it can really just sort of deplete that moisture right away. So I would say, yeah, temperature plays a decent part in keeping the plant happy, but it's also the draft. Most plants really don't like that, like draft and rapid airflow, really. So
like heater flow, is that what you mean?
Yeah, heater, sometimes like I have a really old house, built in the 20s, and I don't have an HVAC system or anything, but I do have like a wall furnace that blows hot air out. And I don't, as much as I'd like to put some plants around that area, I keep that area completely free from any of the plants because they hate that area. So any sort of air movement like that from one source you want to avoid. And the other trick too with the humidity, the transparent trays, the catchment trays, you can fill that with water and just sort of put it in the center with a group of plants around it. And it just sort of over time evaporates and the leaves are able to absorb that moisture.
That's a great
in the air. Wow. So sometimes, again, back in the day when I would be gone for an extended period of time, I would just put a shallow container, usually like a catchment system, filled with water. So then it slowly evaporates around the plants.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Sure. Okay. What do you think of watering with bottled water? Personally, I don't buy bottled water, so I would hate it, but it's really up to you. I have my own thoughts about bottled water, so I'm not sure. I just always use tap water, and I have used for my really finicky plants, I get the water from my Berkey filter. And then water them rather than straight from the faucet.
Which of your plants can have been finicky about their chlorinated water?
You know, the Aurelia, which is a really hard plant for me to keep alive. I'm on my third Aurelia. It's, I forget the variety, but it sort of looks like a 7-leafed fringe. It looks like a hand, and it's like a tree. It almost looks like marijuana leaves a little bit, but that particular plant does not like hard water. So I use my Berkey for that one. And it's just, the one thing I hate is once the water is filtered, transferring the water from my Berkey filter into the actual watering can to water my plants. It's a lot of work, but I don't do that often. Okay, so I'm looking at more questions here. What are some good resources to get fun, colorful pots? Okay, so the resources that I listed on the slides with the local nurseries, I would say so. And there's one in Sunil, the big pottery place, although I don't know if they have a whole bunch of small indoor plant pots, but I know they have large pots off of 680, I believe, but you can really get creative with the pots. You could use unconventional things as indoor pots, like really eclectic items. Okay, it doesn't look like there are many questions here.
I have another question.
Sure.
I have this plant. I don't know what it is.
I cannot see what that is. Let me.
Well, do you know what I'm saying? In this round thingy, it's a Japanese like orb or something.
Oh yeah, yeah. Totally.
And I mean, it is grown so well. It's incredible. But you know, I find sources online, and what it tells me to do is like, that has not been what's worked, soaking this thing all the time in water. But I wonder, I think that this is supposed to be green, or it could grow. I don't know. I was wondering if you have any input.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what that is. It could be one of two things. It can be a moss, and if so, it should be greener than that, or it could also be sort of a cocoa core. And most likely cocoa core is what I'm thinking, rather than moss, although it could very well be moss. I just cannot tell from that. If it's cocoa core, it's going to remain that color, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's already dead, so it's not live or anything.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? I know we're right at our end of class time here.
Yes, Kim. Do you recommend putting rocks at the bottom of the decorative pots as well?
That's a fantastic question. So really depends on the on your pot. So if your decorative pot has no holes and you're using that 2-pot system, obviously not recommended to put rocks or anything like that. If it does have a hole, what I do recommend is getting a filter fabric, like a geotextile or Marify fabric that lets water through and not the soil and other amendments through the hole. And I'd line that at the bottom, so then it collects all the organic matter from flowing out the drain hole. And also if your decorative pot does have a hole and you're putting the plastic pot inside the decorative pot, I do recommend getting a saucer for it regardless. So you really don't want to put any pot with hole directly on your floors, wood floors especially, or carpet for that matter. So
if it doesn't have a hole, we don't need any rocks or any kind of things to, I guess, help with the drainage or evaporation of the water that will come through the plastic pot. That's what I'm trying to
Yeah, not necessarily. I've never used them just because it tends to get heavy. But again, the key thing is you're not going to overwater where the water's just sitting in your decorative pot. So just enough so it evaporates over time within about a day or two. But if your decorative pot is just puddled and the water raises more than about half an inch to an inch is like really too much, but a 1/4 inch to half an inch, you really want to dump that excess water out right away, because then it'll create, you know, a bad odor and it'll just really collect and will be a bug trap in a sense. So if you want to elevate the plant, really a trick is I've used multiple pots, even a pot turned upside down, and I've put pot on top of that, because some of the decorative pots are really larger than the actual plant that I'm putting in, and then I've elevated it that way. And yeah, you could do that because you know, you don't want the small plant to be all the way at the bottom, and it's kind of hard. So
okay, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Sure. I think Marla has a question there.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Does variegated ginger grow indoors? It's rather, it has such big, beautiful leaves.
Yeah, my understanding is variegated ginger is meant for ornamental growth. And correct me if I'm wrong, but does it actually produce ginger? Do you know, or?
I don't know. I have 2 plants, but they're outside in pots.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're beautiful, but I don't want, I'm scared to move them.
You can always, you know, with the rhizome clippings, you just take a little bunch and experiment indoors and bring them inside. If the plant won't die, it'll just keep on sort of shooting out more growth.
Okay.
But I really think they're ornamental rather than a productive plant.
So for outside?
Well, I'm not so sure. You can bring them inside and give it a try, see if it's successful.
Okay. The ones I have outside are beautiful. They love it. But when it gets cold, like I say cold, it's like 35. It's getting cold. I cover them with bed sheets.
Yeah, and you know, we had frost warning here in the Bay Area yesterday night or the night before, I forget, and I had to go out and cover some of my plants as well. And it's very rare here, but I know in some parts of the country it happens quite often. So the key thing is most of the tropical plants really cannot handle cold.
Yeah, we cover ours. We're in San Antonio.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't have to very much, but we do. Oh, not too often. Thank you.
Sure.
It was a great class.
You're welcome.
We're going to have your email with the link sent.
Yes, so we're actually past the time here. So what I was thinking, I think we should wrap up here, and I will go ahead and send out the link for the recorded class so you can watch it. And I'll also send the PDF copy of the presentation that you saw today. And if you have any questions, go ahead and email me, and I'm happy to help you out with your questions. But other than that, I just want to say thank you to everybody who attended. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Take care.
Can I have one last question for you? I have a Pythos that has some gray mold on it. Would you just recommend getting rid of it? Or have you had any luck with compost tea?
Oh, mold is a tough one, Brooke. I think what I would do is the master, have you sent a picture of it to the Master Gardeners hotline and see what they, you know?
No, I haven't. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I would probably do that because I think molds have different varieties, and it's hard for me to distinguish what it is. And I would send it to them, or just look at the UC Davis IPM guideline on how to sort of get rid of that. I haven't really had mold issues that much, just because I tend to underwater than overwater, I think. So.
Yeah, and this is just one particular plant. They got it really early after I bought it. So I think it was infested whenever I got it. So I've kept it quarantined, like you said, but it's just so beautiful and unique with the variegation that I'm having a hard time throwing it away.
Yeah. I hate to say this, but I've lost a whole bunch of my plants to other diseases that I wasn't too happy about, but sometimes you just have to let go of it and just get it from a different vendor.
Thank you again.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you.
Sure. Take care, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.